from a lot of folks from all over the US who have been organizing on this. And that's not even all the people in the coalition. We can't possibly get all of them on here. But, you know, hope that after this, you all can try to get plugged in with any of the organizations that you're excited to learn more about, and want to, you know, thank everyone who is like helping out with this today. So please do, for folks who are still joining, you know, feel free to share in the chat where you are joining us from, and give me 1 second to pull up our slides. All right, can you all see that pink background slide that I have up? Okay, great. So like I mentioned, you know, tonight, this town hall is really about the basics of CVE. So we love that there are a lot of experts who are joining us tonight too. But we want to prioritize a few things in this conversation, which is really talking about just the basics of what CVE is and how it impacts Muslims in particular. So we're asking that you use the chat, you know, please do, you know, send questions, engage with each other through the chat. There's too many people on here, so we have it webinar style, but you can definitely use the chat to talk. We want you to be curious, open, and respectful. So we know CVE is a hard topic. We know it causes a lot of friction, but we hope that you all, you know, can be open to what we're sharing tonight as folks who have been talking about this for quite some time. And again, we're going to prioritize Muslims in terms of asking questions. Of course, we don't know who is Muslim, so that is something we need you all to do. So just make sure, you know, if you're not Muslim, you are welcome to stay, but we would love, I like that someone just asked if they can, you can contact the panelists if we don't answer your questions. You cannot attack the panelists if we don't answer your questions. But please do, you know, send your questions as you go along. Hopefully we're going to cover some of those basic things. So you're going to hear from me, Celine, and Yezen on the overview, how to spot CVE, consequences and harm. That is going to take about 30 minutes total, and then we're going to do about 30 to 45 minutes of Q&A. So we're really going to do a lot of question and answer, but again, when we do that portion, we want Muslim folks and we want intro level questions. So if you're here to learn like what algorithm some specific grant is using, or to get super in depth, that's not what we're doing tonight. And we ask that you just take a step back so we can let other folks have their questions answered today. All right. So what even is CVE? If you can see this list, hopefully this list is big enough for you all to see. This is actually the most recent CVE risk factor list put out by the Department of Justice. So you'll see up here, it says National Institute of Justice That's the research arm of the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice is the main, law enforcement institution in the US. You can see here what some of these things are getting at, right? None of these things say Muslim, and yet we know deep down exactly what this is about, right? Having a terrorist friend, having extremist ideology, the fact that this is about terrorism and extremism and radicalization, and the way that these programs are actually, implemented, it becomes really clear that this is about Muslims. These things are not getting applied to everyone else, right? So imagine that you are, a Muslim who, maybe had the cops called on you at some point, as I think I know at least in Boston, if you live in like Dorchester or Roxbury, like I wouldn't be shocked if you've had the cops called on you. Maybe your teachers think that your group of Muslim friends are extreme because y'all, joke about certain things or are particularly religious, or they think that you're in a gang, which I think is also a common occurrence for a lot of young people of color. Maybe you've spoken to a therapist at any point in your life, which I really hope that many of us are speaking to therapists and seeking out that kind of support. Maybe you are struggling to keep a job because of COVID, and many of us, I'm guessing, have had romantic breakups or family fights or, friendship breakups and stopped being friends with somebody. And yet that could mean that you're just like a millennial Muslim. I think having a sporadic work history and like a terrible love life is pretty much a lot of us who are in our 20s and 30s. Or, according to Homeland Security and the Department of Justice, you are on a path to becoming a terrorist or a violent extremist. And if that sounds absurd, it's because it really, really is. It is truly that absurd, but it's very much hidden. When you go to a CVE program, they're not going to show you this list of indicators. You're not going to see what they applied for, how they got the money to do these programs. But this is what's behind it. So imagine what this actually looks like in our communities. Imagine that your teachers were trained using that list by counterterrorism students. That's actually happening in Massachusetts, to look at you or your children with that lens. And this little screenshot I have, it might not be big enough, but again, that is from a Massachusetts program that is training teachers to look at our kids in this way. And they start with listing all the kinds of terrorism here: 9/11, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Islamic extremist, radicalization, terrorism on the internet. Imagine that your therapist was also trained by the FBI to diagnose you with that lens and regularly coordinate with the FBI on that. That's a national program that is happening through the Department of Justice. And there's also many local versions of that in LA and Boston and many other cities. And then there's some things that might seem innocuous. Like, what if your masjid has a basketball or soccer program that was only funded because they said it was going to prevent you from becoming a violent extremist? We all want that kind of programming, right? We do want healthcare support. We do want basketball and soccer programs and like community programs. But the fact that we're only getting it because we're seen as ticking time bombs is really disgusting. And not everyone is treated that way. And we don't have to be treated that way. We don't deserve that. So the other thing that I need you all to know, if there's like one thing that you leave here with, it's that CVE, the premise of it is just, it's nonsense. And this, you can see, is from the Department of Homeland Security. It's from the same place where I found that risk factor list that I showed a little bit ago. One of their key points, having one or more risk factors does not mean an individual will engage in targeted violence or terrorism. Again, having one or more risk factors does not mean an individual will engage in targeted violence or terrorism. You will find this kind of disclaimer in pretty much any CVE literature, any CVE application that you find, it'll have this type of disclaimer. And you also can't show that it works because if there's no, you can't predict who will commit violence, which is what they're saying. And so you also can't test it to say, yeah, this person didn't commit violence because we had them play soccer through this funding. So in terms of like just scientific research, it has been shown time and time again that this is junk science, that it's nonsense, and also it's these same institutions, Homeland Security and Department of Justice, that are funding any of the research that supports the program that they want to do. So the core of that, you know, why would they have that? Why put so much money into something like this if it doesn't actually work, it doesn't actually prevent people from committing violence? It's all about criminalization. So when you think about policing, we're talking about a spectrum of what happens to folks, right? And many of us think about when someone actually interacts with police, or when they're prosecuted through court, or when they're incarcerated, or afterwards. But everything that leads up to, you know, the police attacking you in some way is this concept of criminalization. It's not just about, you know, what is actually legal or illegal. It's about who we think is a criminal, and everything, how we talk about our people, how we talk about other people, right? So probably a lot of you have seen this meme, and also maybe a lot of you have just seen this trend of the same kind of violence from different people. We use different language, right, about different folks. And that is part of that criminalization, right? You're a criminal if you're Muslim and you do the same thing that a white person does. And that's part of CVE. That's really one of the main pillars of it, is to further criminalize not just Muslims, but Black people, people of color, immigrants, refugees, and so on. So just a few more items for you all before Celine takes over. One of the key things about CVE is this language, right? Like I said, CVE doesn't say Muslim, right? It says countering violent extremism, preventing violent extremism, building resilience. None of those things explicitly name Muslims. And when we think about who is extreme, this is usually what people think of, this political spectrum, right? Where, you know, there are folks who are in the center or moderate, there's conservatives and there's liberals, and then, you know, there's the extreme right and the extreme left. And you'll hear a lot of both sides language, particularly from President Trump, right? Saying there are good people on both sides. The reality is we don't have to use this spectrum when we're actually talking about white supremacy. So for folks who think, well, don't we want to do something about white supremacist violence? We do live in a very violent country. And obviously none of us are against actually preventing violence, right? But we have to name what the root causes are and understand who is actually called extreme, right? So that picture that I just showed where, you know, white supremacist violence, it's never named that way, right? those folks get called, you know, mentally disturbed, or, you know, they were a good kid that went on the wrong path. They don't get called terrorists, and that is by design. So what if you look at it this way? You have systemic white supremacy, which is what so much of this country is built on, right? That's things like the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, these really fundamental parts of the US, right? And that core part of it is the anti-Black racism and, you know, the enslavement of Black people that started this country. And then you have cultural and institutional white supremacy that feeds off of that, right? So the media, if you watch the show Homeland with Claire Danes, like really good example of cultural white supremacy and cultural anti-Muslim rhetoric in particular. And then you have that individual violence. So when a white supremacist, you know, commits an act of horrible violence, it's actually just part of the system, and it is part of the norm. And so it's not extreme, and it's not going to be called extreme. And we're kind of fighting a losing battle every time we want to call that terrorism or call it extreme, because that language, right, it's in the eye of the beholder. It has to be defined in relation to something. And so we have to recognize that if this is the system, it's not going to be seen as extreme, but everybody else outside of this system will be seen as extreme in certain ways. So we have to be conscious of that language and name what we're actually talking about. We can say, yeah, we do want to fight white supremacist violence, and that's absolutely true. And you can see examples of who is actually called extreme over and over and over again. So this, you know, these are some of the words, right, that we see for Muslims all the time: fanatic, radical, extreme. And here's an example from the 1930s of the FBI surveilling Muslims, surveilling Black Muslims specifically, because they learned that this group, the Moorish Science Temple, cared about racial equality and carried membership cards that indicated that. And so on learning this, the FBI concluded that this person that they found was a fanatic on the subject of equality for all races. This then launched a major surveillance program before COINTELPRO, like a huge surveillance program of Muslims in particular. And I will say, even though this is recorded, that I am indeed a fanatic of racial equality. And that is why I do this work, right? But we know how that language is used against our people. And so one more example of that is our dear Malcolm X, who, if you don't know, grew up in Boston, and I feel like everyone needs to know that, who here says, you know, when a man that they've been taught is below them has the nerve or firmness to question some of their philosophies, they put that label on him of extremist, right? It is intended to make us seem like we're outside of the norm and like we're violent and dangerous and we're so radical for asking for our rights, for fighting for our rights of not just Muslims, of Black folks, of queer folks, of all oppressed folks. So we have to be, you know, really conscious of that language and start thinking about how extreme, radical, terrorism, how those things are used. And I think I'm way over my time, so I'm so sorry. And I think Yezen is actually up next.
Hi folks, so my name is Yezen and I'm with Vigilant Love, also a partner in the StopCVE coalitional work. So I'm just gonna really briefly go over some tips to identify CVE by going over different examples of CVE programming. And so this first slide right here is the typical themes or patterns that CVE grants usually follows. And so the broad categories that we named here are public health, mental health, K through 12 programming, university settings, digital CVE, and bystander trainings. And so we'll just do a quick walkthrough of different types and red flags that we've identified to help people being able to look at the same programs and see what might be dangerous or how they can identify if something is dangerous. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the first example here, this is for public health. So I don't know if 211 systems are a national system. I'm sure every state has their own version. In California, 211 is a number that you can call off a landline, and then they have a different version you'd call off a cell phone. That's a free 24-hour helpline that basically connects you to county services. So it would be local people who are based in a city. So San Diego is the example. 211 would be a number that you dial. And when you dial that number, someone would be connected to you. And you can ask basic questions to be put in the direction of certain resources. So on the flyer, it's a little bit small, but the examples include health and wellness, housing and utilities, enrollment services, food assistance, disaster support. So just very, very universal things like about city information about how to get tapped into resources around that. And so the individual service providers will have a database that they can access where they would be able to redirect you to anything. So a lot of folks, for example, who newly moved to San Diego can call and say, I'm a newly resettled refugee. Where can I access food distribution? Where can I access nonprofits that would help with immigration paperwork? Where can I find out how to register my child for school? Like these kinds of very basic things. And 211 very recently accepted money from preventing violent extremism, which is very similar to countering violent extremism. They use very similar frameworks, typically targets youth or health settings. And in that project, what they decided to do was they wanted to use the 211 county line to create a referral network. So if people called in with specific cases, like I need help with a specific DV case, then 211 would have the authority to report them to an interdisciplinary team for further support. And so the referral network that they wanted to create was specifically supposed to make it easier for 211 correspondents to be able to talk to local federal agents, police officers, and emergency services. And so the way that they framed it was that a lot of people who rely on 211 services often don't have the resources that they need, and that isolation creates a lack of trust that leaves them predisposed to committing violence. And so isolation is a word that you'll often hear that's supposed to be an indicator of someone being likely to commit extremism. Lack of trust in community or towards specific entities like the state, like the government, is also supposed to be another indicator. And then lack of integration. So if someone is like removed from the periphery, right? Also, I can see someone's WhatsApp screen. Anyway, so just to be clear, the way that these different indicators, when you read them out loud in that language, it sounds very neutral. But what you end up having happen is that lack of integration is obviously a reference to cultural assimilation. Isolation is also a reference to assimilation, especially if you're thinking of youth who are newly moved from another country and trying to integrate into a specific community and having a hard time. This specific program also relies really heavily on law enforcement integration. And the model that they're claiming that they're using is called prevention and intervention. So by providing this referral network, they can refer community members that they think are likely to commit extremist violence to appropriate authorities to be handled. And if you think about it from a class perspective, the folks who are most likely going to be needing to rely on county services instead of their own networks are people who are newly relocated, are people who don't have wealth or assets in the community, are people who don't have other existing networks that they can tap on. So this is primarily thinking of San Diego, for example. It's one of the largest refugee populations in the United States. They are the folks who rely really heavily on services like 211. If we can move to the next one. So this next example is regarding mental health. So Los Angeles Police Department has their PATH and RENEW programs. PATH is the program that follows RENEW that is supposed to directly integrate interactions between mental health, law enforcement, and JTTFs, which is Joint Terrorist Task Force entities. And the way that PATH and Renew work is that for people who are service providers or social workers that are deputized by LAPD PATH program, they are then placed in interdisciplinary teams where they would refer people that they think are likely to commit acts of extremism to law enforcement or JTTF as they see fit. On top of that, there's also what they referenced was a 24-hour triage desk. And this is specifically to help direct police officers through behavioral risk assessments when they counter an individual perceived to be suffering from a mental health crisis. And I think that specific point is really important because what you have is the criminalization of mental health. So people who are having a really hard time in any context, and we know the ways in which political violence or poverty or other types of oppression creates different experiences of mental health, that becomes a risk factor for you committing a crime. Similarly to 211, it's not that there are no resources for refugee communities to try to figure out how to assimilate or at least integrate and have safe access to food and shelter. Instead, that becomes an indicator. So that lack of community and material support from the government is actually something that they become blamed for. But an indicator here would be a police partnership with mental health and service providers. Why would you need police and the Department of Homeland Security to be working so closely with mental health and service providers, right? This is something that immediately should signal a red flag. Whenever there are a lot of different kinds of CVE grants that try to incorporate DHS or police into community settings that should be free of those things, especially when you're thinking of the communities of color that are usually targeted by these grants. It's usually migrants, it's refugees, it's usually Muslim communities that are either working class or maybe middle class. So there's a lot of ways that these communities are already policed and surveilled. So when you see police being integrated into services that are presumably entirely separate from police, that's a red flag. Collapsing mental health needs with violence, right? So someone's mental health is not actually the concern. This person's well-being is not a concern. Instead, it's the future concern of the hypothetical act they might commit against other people. So these kinds of things are really important to think about as red flags. Who's being centered in these types of programs? Is the person at hand the person that we're actually trying to support? Or is it that we are creating future victims based on a projection that this person will commit violence? And these questions here are the types of questions that are included in questionnaires to be asked. Have you traveled recently? Do you have a religious community affiliation? Do you have animosity towards any religious community or political group? Right? So they're very racialized. They're obviously geared towards specific people identifying with religious community. And they're also penalizing people who have anger that's very valid or frustration that's very valid with political systems, right? If you think of refugees who are displaced by war, there is an absolutely justified frustration with the US government. In this context, that's something that becomes an indicator. Next slide, please. Bike Cops for Kids, Minneapolis. So this is a program that actually creates, basically the Minneapolis police go around and distribute essential gear for bicycles. So helmets, reflectors, water bottles, sometimes bikes themselves. And the goal of the program is to create a positive relationship between community and police. And so sometimes, like the examples here, there's police officers who directly hand out bikes for free to working class or middle class community members. And other times it's that they'll be providing the equipment. And at the same time, they also do like an ice cream patrol. And they'll have an ice cream truck where they also hand out like helmets and reflectors and gears and these kinds of things. And so when you think of this, right here, there's a thing that says daily bike patrol. So we're trying to meet community where they're at. We're trying to meet youth where they're at on their turf, right? And it's supposed to be this thing that sounds really innocent or charitable. But when you think about it, for example, in the top left, this community member who had her bike stolen, and Minneapolis police provided her with a new one because that was her only method of transportation. And so the report back from the police was this community member was very grateful. So earlier, Fatima was referencing that there's a huge need for a lot of the things that are being provided. The question is, what's the intention? In this specific scenario, it's building trust, right? They want to establish positive relations. If you read about the reason that Bike Cops for Kids was founded in Minneapolis, it's based on a lot of reports that a lot of community members have felt threatened, have felt targeted, have felt persecuted by police in their neighborhood time and time again. And so this is something that they call a building trust initiative, but one that we can recognize by reading between the lines is public relations, right? It's PR work. We're going to be doing this thing. And if you look at the daily bike patrol, sure, Minneapolis police is providing gear daily by patrolling, but what this also means is that Minneapolis police is regularly patrolling Minneapolis neighborhoods and is going to always be in the same spaces that youth are in, right? So there's a lot of policing that's automatically happening, even if it's happening with a smile. Last but not least, this specific program here is police building partnerships with correctional facilities. So trying to establish relationships with youth currently incarcerated in different, in this one, it's Red Wing Correctional Facility. So thinking about what it means for youth who've already been impacted by the school to prison pipeline, having to build relationships with police before they're able to leave, right? And what goals that might reach for the police that they wouldn't name. So for us here, the red flags are police patrol of youth, building trust. Trust is an enormous countering violent extremism word. Building trust between agents, building trust between community members, building trust between religious institutions and police, and establishing positive relations, right? Because what's happening here is there's a lot of emphasis on wanting to establish positive relationships, but there's never a reference to why there's a negative relationship in the first place. These reports that Minneapolis police have written about why they went to found the program, they don't say we've killed a large number of unarmed Black men, or we've contributed to the incarceration of lots of Black youth, and this is why people hate us. What they say is police only are seen in communities when there's community member on community member violence. And so youth have an unhealthy association with police because their communities are so violent, right? So there's a lot of criminalization of community without any accountability from police. Next slide, please. This is very overwhelming to look at. You don't have to look at it all. This is the university examples. So this is targeted violence. And also to mention before, the grant for the Bikes for Cops comes from a program called COPS. It's a grant program that's very similar to CVE. It's called Community-Oriented Policing. And I'm intentionally giving different examples of grants to show that CVE doesn't have to be officially CVE grants for it to be using the same frameworks. This right here is actually CVE. It's the new name TVTP, which is Targeted Violence and Terrorist Prevention. These are all the grants that universities were given from the 2020 grant cycle. So we will see what this will actually unfold into. But the reason that I decided to include all of these universities is because every single university got funding for something entirely different from the other universities. So the American University Funds is actually going to their communications department. And in their communications department, they're going to be creating a module that's supposed to presumably define and describe the growing threat of violent white supremacist extremist disinformation. So as Fatima had mentioned before, there's a lot of hesitancy around what it would mean to actually target white supremacy if there's so much already geared towards targeting people who identify as Muslim, people who identify as Arab, South Asian, East African, or African American, right? Another university, Xavier University, is going to be partnering with local police and will be trying to provide training and awareness programs to community partners. So this is an example where a university is being placed in conversation with police, and they are the ones who are connecting police to local nonprofits and service providers to try to help identify individuals radicalizing to violence. Another example, if we look at the bottom left, is the Graduate Department of Psychology at the University of Denver. If you look at the middle, it's Florida University Police Department. So police departments on campuses specifically being funded to identify and stop extremist violence, right? And you'll also have grants that go to STEM fields, engineering. You'll have grants that go to things relating to directly to conflict resolution or Department of Homeland Security programs. So the types of funding that goes out is very, very vast, very, very different. But all of it basically boils down to its DHS funding departments. This is an enormous red flag from the beginning. Any federal funding that comes from DHS, from the CIA, from FBI, there's a huge question of why that would be and what they stand to gain from it. This is, if you think about the university as a space where people are supposed to be learning, what will they be learning if they're being encouraged by intelligence agents to do certain things, right? And then thinking about the course offerings, there's a lot of times where course offerings specifically teach students to think certain ways. So social workers and psychologists will have courses offered to them that teach them CVE frameworks and how they perceive their patients, right? There's also a lot of police-military partnerships. Almost all of these grants here have some sort of police or military partnership. And last but not least, there's a lot of sub-granting that happens. So the reason that the Department of Homeland Security will fund universities is because universities usually have stronger community relationships and will be able to identify the best nonprofits or the best religious institutions to enact CVE. So if money goes to a university like Xavier University, which is a private Jesuit school, they're the ones who are already located where they are. They know what partners to contact and who will sign on to enacting CVE across the whole county. Next slide, please. Last but not least is digital CVE. So this is Life After Hate. They're a really popular example of like corrected former white supremacists and former white nationalists and right-wing extremists who now advocate for anti-racism and they advocate for anti-bullying. And so Life After Hate has actually received CVE funding twice. And the reason that there's a lot of anxiety and a lot of hesitation around Life After Hate is because they externally look like it's a creation of equal opportunity CVE. Okay, Muslim communities felt criminalized by CVE will also target white people too. But we know systemically this isn't how it works, right? It also misrepresents the reach of CVE. The people that are criminalized and the people that are penalized by countering violent extremism will experience it very differently depending on what race, ethnicity, religion, and class and citizenship status they have, right? Specifically, Life After Hate is also really important because they've created a lot of technological advances for surveillance. So Life After Hate has actually developed algorithms that are supposed to be able to detect hate speech, and they've received awards for this. And these algorithms actually, presumably the way that they created it, it targets white supremacy, but the algorithm itself, what it does is it targets anything that can be considered hate speech and purposefully, one, reduces the impact of that post. So if it's a social media post, it will automatically reduce how often it's seen. And it'll also flag it so that people who make the post are also people who are taken into consideration. So if we think about how Life After Hate works in relation to people who are organizing against war or against Zionism, or people who are organizing against US imperialism, right? And what is considered hate speech, then we can also think about how an algorithm designed by people like Life After Hate will obviously target them, and how these systems that we've already been describing that are purposefully targeting these communities will impact them a lot more. Anyway, so for us here, the red flag is the idea of equal opportunity CVE. Because of how our communities experience state violence, we know that by simply adding white supremacy, it's not going to be enough or any way to support community from being able to actually organize autonomously and safely. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Yazan. If we could go to the next slide, I'm just going to be talking about what are the implications and consequences of CVE in our communities and why is it harmful. So again, my name is Celine Kosini. I'm with the Palestinian Youth Movement, also a member of the StopCVE National Coalition. So regarding why CVE is harmful for our communities, CVE operates by having law enforcement partner with community institutions that have pre-existing relationships or trust with community members. And it calls on those institutions and their service providers, educators, faith leaders, whoever it may be, to report on their own community members. So basically, CVE institutionalizes Islamophobia by legitimizing stereotypes of Muslims as inherently dangerous or prone to extremism. It also creates a culture of distrust between community members and between community members and their institutions, and basically discourage our access to various community and social services. And I'll also be sharing a little bit about the PREVENT program in the United Kingdom, which is about 7-ish years ahead of where we are right now with CVE in the US, just to give an example of where we're headed with the CVE programs and why we need to stop it. So let's see, if we can go to, yes, there we go. Thank you. So as Fatima explained, these programs assume that our communities are inherently criminal or quote unquote prone to extremism, right? And she talked about what extremism actually entails. So for example, increased religiosity would be seen as an indicator of potential extremist violence. So basically by categorizing our basic everyday religious or community practices as potential indicators of extremism, that in turn justifies the policing and surveillance of our everyday lives and of our communities at large. It assumes that our Muslim communities are always suspicious and that we're perpetually seen as at risk of becoming extremists. So not only does this reinforce these racist stereotypes about Muslim communities, but it is completely scientifically unsound as a claim. There's no proof or backing of this whatsoever. And CVE by design has intensified anti-Muslim, anti-Black, and anti-immigrant systems by expanding the policies that have historically targeted these communities. So we can see, for example, how the CVE programs and this theory of quote unquote radicalization, how this builds off of the legacy of programs that have historically targeted Black communities. So I'll use broken windows policing as an example. So broken windows policing heavily impacted Black communities starting in the 80s. And it is based on this idea that the cultural, social, and local norms of Black communities can potentially lead to the development of criminal activity. So it is this logic that everyday practices of Black communities can potentially lead to violence, which justified in turn the policing of everyday life in Black communities, because it links that everyday activity with the quote unquote potential for crime. And we see how similar this idea of quote unquote radicalization is, expanding to criminalize Muslim communities more broadly by linking our everyday activity with the potential for extremism or terrorism. And this is just important to inform how we think about what it really means to stand in solidarity with Black Muslim communities and Black communities more broadly when we invite police into our community or faith spaces, knowing the violence that law enforcement has caused Black communities, and also knowing that law enforcement partnerships simply do not work and do not make us any safer. As we've seen throughout history and throughout the experience of these CVE programs, inviting law enforcement into our spaces furthers distrust and suspicion and furthers surveillance and criminalization of Muslims. It reinforces the stereotype that we are quote unquote potential extremists and thus need to be monitored and surveilled. So again, these partnerships are never about safety to begin with. And if we want to actually be building a culture of care for one another and not policing one another, we need to be organizing against these CVE programs, rejecting the funding, and actively informing our community members about why these programs are so harmful to our communities, right? Again, ultimately, what these programs do is they criminalize outward expressions, including religiosity or politicization, that is expressed by Muslim communities, and it makes us fearful of remaining adamant in our identities or in our expressions as Muslims. I think one other part of this is that these programs create a culture of distrust and suspicion between community members, right? Because community members are being invited to report on one another through these programs. And this discourages our access to various community and social services. So it's already so hard for Muslims to go to school and feel comfortable. For example, I'm sure we all know about the case of Ahmed Muhammad, who was a young Sudanese Muslim student who brought a disassembled clock to school and was reported on by his teacher. So, who basically thought he brought a bomb to school. And she obviously was looking at him as a national security threat. So imagine this type of reporting was mandated, and imagine that it was required by all teachers to look at youth through a national security lens. Imagine the impact that this would have on Muslim youth. If, again, educators were required to look at youth through a counterterrorism lens and required to report on them. So again, right, the way these programs operate is by having law enforcement partner with organizations that already have relationships to the community, including educational institutions, and calls on them to do the reporting, right? So one of the implications of CVE is that it authorizes or deputizes mental health providers, teachers, community leaders, and any other service providers to identify and report on individuals who are perceived to be quote unquote prone to extremism based off of the Islamophobic and racist indicators that Fatima mentioned in the beginning. And basically CVE equates like religious difference, political difference with violence, and recruits community members to watch out for terrorism and report on each other. So another thing that, another consequence that these programs have is that CVE ultimately provides law enforcement access into spaces that otherwise would be unavailable to them, spaces that otherwise should be safe and confidential for our community members, right? Through these referrals or reports from service providers and educators, for example, law enforcement would gain access to the classroom, to the therapist's office, to the masajid, to various spaces where we receive services. And this just makes it all the more difficult for Muslim communities to seek services and to be present in our faith and community spaces without fear of being surveilled. And if we can go back to the previous slide real quick, I'm gonna just read really quickly this quote out loud about how CVE has impacted Somali youth in Minneapolis. So Ramla, who's a community activist in Minneapolis, says that, quote unquote, the CVE program has caused immense harm to the communities that it targets. From fear of biased targeting and unjust prosecution to stifling civic engagement, young Somalis and their families continue to experience loss even after the program's end. CVE has policed and criminalized Islam and Somaliness to the point that some young people are self-censoring to deflect targeting. And CVE has eroded community trust by embedding law enforcement with nonprofit organizations, public agencies, and philanthropy. And it created a blueprint that continues to fuel similar initiatives under different names. So we can see how these programs really cause this, this culture of distrust between community members, because we start wondering, how can I access this service without knowing whether they're gonna report on me? Can I trust this person? How will I know that what I'm saying won't be deemed an indicator of quote unquote extremism? So again, what these programs are doing is they're funding community and religious organizations through a counterterrorism framework. It reifies the idea that we only deserve resources because we're deemed a threat. And these partnerships between community institutions, educational institutions, mental health departments, and law enforcement only results in further surveillance and criminalization, as well as reinforcement of these Islamophobic stereotypes. So we can go to the next slide real quick. So where is CVE headed? Like looking a few years ahead, where will it be? How will it expand? We can learn from the PREVENT program in the United Kingdom. And I'm pulling these resources in these slides about PREVENT. I'm pulling them from CAGE, which is a nonprofit that has been fighting the PREVENT program for a really long time. So I encourage you all to check out CAGE UK. So again, in the United States, these programs are currently being implemented in different cities, counties, and states. In the UK, however, it is a nationalized program, and it is a part of the UK's counter-terror strategy. And it requires all people who work in the public sector, including teachers, mental health professionals, and social workers, to identify and report on those who are deemed to be at risk of quote unquote radicalization. And these indicators of the PREVENT program are similarly Islamophobic, similar to CVE, right? So what are the implications of PREVENT? According to CAGE, the implications include disproportionately targeting Muslims, having emerged in a context of widespread Islamophobia based on the notion of Muslims as walking terror threats. It undermines civil liberties. It fuels suspicion and alters the nature of relationships between people, communities, and institutions. And it basically turns welfare and faith support into arms of surveillance, which again is an especially insidious aspect of this program, right? Like, no community can be empowered if it is fragmented. And what has been released is that counter-terror police across the UK have actually been running a secret database containing details of thousands of individuals, thousands of Muslims who were referred to the government's PREVENT program. So we can go to the next slide real quick. So I'm going to give a couple of case studies from the CAGE reports. So the first one of how this operates in the UK, we'll take the example of a 14-year-old Muslim teenager who was studying in the 9th grade and who was a devout Muslim, who regularly attended his local mosque, took a proactive approach in increasing his religious spirituality. In 2015 was referred to a PREVENT officer without the consent of his parents. And when his sister contacted the school asking for a formal meeting, they told her that the reason he was referred to PREVENT was due to his him not proactively participating in music lessons. And for him, there was this, in his interpretation of Islam, there was a tension between with music and his interpretation of Islam, so he did not wish to partake in music lessons. So there's really no real ground for referring this individual to PREVENT. There was a question on what evidential basis not engaging in a music lesson would even be a marker for radicalization or extremism. So this is really clearly anti-Muslim racism. And it illustrates how PREVENT also operates under the radar. And there's so many cases across London where parents have absolutely no knowledge that their children are being referred and questioned by PREVENT personnel during school hours. So this shows, again, how deeply anti-Muslim these programs are, how these educators are trained to look at students as national security threats, and what very tangible consequences can result from mandated reporting. And there's another similar case. I have a picture here where in the UK, a 4-year-old was referred because his teacher thought he drew a bomb when really he was drawing a picture of his dad cutting him a cucumber. So this is where these programs are headed, again, where youth and community members, Muslim community members, are being looked at as national security threats. And Black, Brown, Indigenous Muslim youth are being looked at as national security threats. And we can see how very tangibly these experiences really traumatize youth and their families, leaving students and youth, again, reluctant to either join and partake in their classroom discussions or even access services for fear of being suspected of extremism. So again, to recap, CVE will lead to, and we can go to the final slide, just to recap why are we organizing to stop CVE? Again, it legitimizes and justifies harms and discrimination against Muslims and marginalized communities. It deputizes service providers and educators to report on community members. And it funds community and religious organizations through a counterterrorism framework, right? So it will lead to much more harm. It will bolster the school to prison pipeline. It will increase the policing and surveillance of Black and Muslim communities, and it will discourage access to healthcare and other services. And we can easily see the damage done in the UK with PREVENT programs. So we must be organizing actively to stop the entire CVE framework immediately. Thanks all. We can open up to Q&A in a bit.
Awesome. Thank you, Celine, and thank you, Yazan, and everyone who is sending in questions and answering questions. We have Nabiha from Believers Bailout. We have Kifa from Empowered Change. We have Iman from the ACLU of New York. And we have a whole lot of other folks on here helping out from the coalition, and we want to keep answering your questions. I know a few folks have already been sending in questions, and I want to ask that if you've already sent quite a few questions and we've been answering yours, to please take a step back so that other folks can submit some questions to get answered. And I think some of the ones we've already answered, it might be good for us to answer live now too, in case folks haven't read the answers yet. So I'll start with one. Mariam asked, what cities and regions does CVE affect? Basically everywhere is the easiest answer for that. We don't have a federal mandate yet, like the UK does, right? Celine just said that in the UK, people are actually required to report on this, and we don't have that yet, but we have a lot of national CVE level programming happening. So one example is something called DEEP. It's disrupting, I can't remember exactly what it stands for, but I referenced it earlier. It's the Department of Justice working, well, the FBI in particular, working directly with therapists to do CVE programming. So that's something that's going to happen all over the country, and we, don't know exactly what cities that might show up in. And then there's a lot of programming that happens at city and state levels too. So California has a whole state level CVE program called Preventing Violent Extremism. And then here in Massachusetts, we have both a Boston level city program and a Massachusetts state level program impacting us. So what you can do is, the toolkit that we mentioned in the chat, and we can maybe drop that link again. I quite literally just yesterday, I think, added some maps in there, and we'll keep adding more information in there, but those maps can show you some of the city programs, some of the national programs, to get you started on figuring out where it's happening. And I'll take this other question because it's very easy. Do we know if there are folks who are organizing against the PREVENT program in the UK? Absolutely. I think Nabiha actually is going to answer it.
I was just marking that red for you.
Oh, that's fine, Nabiha. I'll do it. Even though Nabiha is not going to answer the question, she's wonderful. So just want to appreciate her. So yes, CAGE in the UK. Oh, thanks for showing your face, Nabiha. CAGE in the UK and Prevent Watch are two of the big groups that do a lot of amazing organizing in the UK. And there's just a ton of, academics and organizers and professionals, therapists, teachers, doctors, who are involved in that organizing, because the UK is about 10 years ahead of us in terms of implementation. So we get to benefit a lot from what they've already done, like that case example that Celine showed of a 4-year-old drawing a picture of their father cooking with cucumbers and getting reported to the government for it.
Also, one question that I saw was if DHS is always required to report who's receiving CVE grants. That one hasn't been answered yet, right? Okay. So the reason that this is actually a really important question is because one of the hardest things to do is to identify whether or not CVE funding is actually CVE funding. We previously mentioned that there were subgrants that sometimes happen. So the example I gave was a university. If a university subgrants money from DHS, so for example, the University of San Diego got $600,000. Once that money gets subgranted out, it becomes a lot harder to trace it as DHS or CVE money. So some nonprofits might actually receive the grant and not know that they received DHS funds. Some will. but it becomes a lot harder. And so for people who are also trying to track the money, organizers who are curious, it also is as vague, because a lot of large grants go out at once, and that money will almost always be redistributed. It can go into salaries, it can go into money for advertising, it can go into money for supplies for a program. So really keeping track is something that's very difficult, and that's intentional. You can't figure out where the money's going, and it just becomes part of the local economy that a specific community that's being targeted by CVE might just absorb, and you don't really know where it's coming from.
I already typed this out, and Yazan's answer was great. I think the other factor that's been something that we've been trying to track down is who gets partnered with on these grant programs. So for instance, the new TVTP grants list a number of universities and police departments and state departments of Homeland Security. However, we don't know necessarily which organizations, people, and masajid that they then partner with to implement those programs. And that's not necessarily on public record, or if it is, it's quite a battle to try to receive those public records.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I actually have one really wild example of DHS giving a lot of funding to a telecommunications company that was then doing CVE in North Carolina. So I previously lived in North Carolina and was alerted by a university professor who had received like a CVE packet. I'm gonna drop a link to this telecommunications company called Wire2Net in the chat. And the people who were doing it said that they worked for Wire2Net, and at the time we couldn't find anything public that said anything about them doing CVE, but they were clearly reaching out to Muslims about it. After some public records requests, I got the contract details for a cybersecurity contract that they had received, and the majority of their cybersecurity contract was actually to do CVE engagement with Muslims in multiple cities. And it took a lot of digging for me to find that. And now their website, I think, does mention it in like one place. But yeah, there's, I think, plenty of really sketchy partnerships that are happening because it's a very like lucrative industry of, you know, getting these types of grants. Y'all are sharing so many great questions. So please do keep them coming.
I see one question from Yasmin about, and it's how do we deal with people in our communities who may be infiltrators or have been targeted by, you know, an intelligence agency to be an infiltrator. Flagging Fatima's great presentation to start infiltration into Muslim communities is a very long-standing and practice by law enforcement agencies that starts with Black political organizing, particularly in Muslim communities. They were targeted in jails or were targeted in their own communities. There was a number of programs such as the counterintelligence program, COINTEL Pro, that was meant to break apart Muslim communities from the inside. I think taking a cue from those historical examples is really important. And a number of different organizations do anti-infiltration trainings, typically for people who are organizers and political activists. But I think given that Muslims are a politicized target by the state, it's always important to try to see if those are resources available to your community. And I've seen this come up twice, so I think I'll give a kind of broad answer about abolition and CVE. So I dropped in an article by Professor Atiya Hussain about abolition and the war on terror. And it's quite good because first she starts with the idea that the reason abolitionists call themselves that is that they see themselves as the inheritors of a tradition of trying to stop the process of racial capitalism that uses Black people as part of the American capitalist system, and trying to abolish that system as it exists today. In terms of abolition and CVE, one thing that her article very beautifully lays out is that there's no real alternative to CVE. So for instance, Fatima has written an article about how there's no equal opportunity CVE. We cannot take a structure that was designed post 9/11 that was meant to target Muslims specifically and use that structure and turn it on someone else. We know that first, it always comes back to Muslim communities. And second, the structure itself doesn't make sense. CVE, violent extremism, and much like terrorism, it doesn't mean anything. These are terms that are used to justify programs, and they can be used against anyone, be it BLM protesters or Muslims who are quite active in their masjids. And so the answer isn't how do we make CVE better or how do we stop violent extremism? The answer is acknowledging that CVE is a program used by the state for its purposes, not for our purposes. And that means that the answer is trying to get rid of it. And so as an abolitionist myself, and here speaking on behalf of Believers Bailout, which is an abolitionist bail fund, we know that these kinds of state programs cannot be, there's no number of people or Muslim consultants or partners that will make it better. The only answer is getting rid of it, which is why the StopCVE Coalition has put together the NTVTP toolkit that MJL has hosted at Bitly.
Yeah, and to explain why it's TVTP on that toolkit, because there's too many acronyms, right? So the new CVE department, they rename it all the time just to confuse us. So the new one is called Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention, TVTP. And just want to add to what Nabiha was just saying, I think that is one of the reasons that this is called countering violent extremism, right? It sounds ridiculous to say that you are against that. It sounds like we're pro-violence, which is obviously nonsense. But the reality is that this does not stop violence. It creates more harm, it creates more violence, and it reinforces the structures of policing and surveillance that creates so much harm, right? Which we're seeing every day, right? And I think as Muslims in particular, we need to step up because this impacts us, of course, but we also know how it impacts Black people in our community. And so we need to, I think, actually not just step up, but lead, right? Lead by example in terms of stepping out of these programs, disengaging from law enforcement, actually going back to more communal types of, dealing with our issues, right? And actually thinking about what we want. Anytime that I talk to Muslim youth in Boston, they're not saying that they want millions of dollars to go towards people calling them terrorists. They're like, give me a free MBTA card so I can ride the train. I don't want cops in my school watching me do my homework. I want a community center where I can actually be Muslim and be Black and be young and live my life without being surveilled. So we also need to think about what does our community actually want, not what law enforcement is pushing down onto us.
Yeah, and I just want to add, I think it's really important to look at CVE through the framework of what we're acknowledging through the Black Lives Matter movement right now across the country. And CVE is a form of police brutality. I mean, this is just an extension of the institution of policing and the harms that we see at the local levels across so many cities, if not, every single city that exists in this country. And so I think we tend, as we talk about it sometimes, to almost separate the two, but they come from the same institution. And as Nabiha addressed, these don't address any of the systemic issues, whether it's the bike mentoring issue, right? Like offering a bike doesn't actually do anything for us. And I know there was a question earlier that we responded to in the chat that was like, wait, but this bike issue, this bike program, isn't that bad, right? Like it's not, what could be so harmful? And it's like, why use this certain money? Why use these certain initiatives to step into a community that has already been very much harmed by law enforcement? So this only continues and perpetuates that sort of incarceral, you know, and the system of police brutality that we're all acknowledging. So again, I think just CVE is that extension of police brutality that we're talking about right now in the streets, in the Black Lives Matter movement, and so many other organizations are kind of targeting. This is no different. And like Nabiha and Fatima have said, there is no alternative to a system or an initiative that hasn't actually done anything to resolve any of the systemic issues we see in this country.
There were a couple of questions on mental health and connecting Muslim communities to mental health providers, and has there been any resistance? So I guess, yes, there have been initiatives to connect Muslim communities to Muslim mental health providers. Chicago is a good example where, there's this idea that terrorism is a Muslim problem and it needs to be taken care of by the Muslim community. And so there's this mobilization in collaboration with the FBI and DHS to put young Muslims in contact with Muslim therapists, Muslim religious leaders to get counseling and to get re-education. And this is a framework that is replicated across the country through interdisciplinary teams and shared responsibility committees. So it might not be explicitly a Muslim mental health provider, but that's encouraged because, again, this is seen as a Muslim problem. And then, has there been resistance? So I don't think there's been institutionalized resistance. I think the American Psychological Association, there's conversation around it. Psychologists are talking about it, but I think the real work has been through political education campaigns, like educating mental health professionals and other social service providers as to why this is harmful, and then to not participate in these programs. That's been effective. I don't know, Yazan, if you want to.
Yeah, I think specifically with this last point, the mobilizing around mental health is something that is trying to manifest itself more. So Vigilant Love has a campaign called Services Not Surveillance, and also StopCVE has a national health team that is working to do both parts that Nicole is referencing. So one, identifying when mental health is being co-opted or used to create harm and justify surveillance, and then on the flip side, creating alternative resources for community. And so thinking about how the state violence that a lot of our communities experience is already so traumatizing in and of itself, that we want to be able to offer these autonomous resources instead of just telling community members, don't use those resources because those are harmful. Because there's a lot of community members who don't have the luxury of being able to say, well, this is potentially unsafe, or this is a political compromise of principle, right? So thinking about how it's a really big burden on community members to just tell them not to use certain resources without being able to support them in finding alternatives or creating those alternatives for them.
Okay. I think one question that I am going to take that someone just sent into the chat, so you all can't see it, but I'll share it. And I know a few folks, I think, also shared it in their registration or are interested in this, which is, how do we confront the folks who are complicit, right? Who are participating in CVE, especially at this point where, we've been talking about it for 5 years. I know I've been talking about it for too long. And there are Muslim organizations in particular that are still working on it, or still doing CVE. So I think, one tactic that we've seen that sometimes is justified is canceling people. And I will say there are some folks who, you know, can be canceled. I know there are folks who participate in CVE even knowing that it's harmful, and particularly are, you know, working with law enforcement because it gives them power over other people. And we've seen people, you know, use that against their community. We've seen, you know, some of these same people also like call the police on folks in the community, and like use their relationships with law enforcement against other folks. And then there's a lot of, I think, people who are participating who don't get it. And I mean, we can see that, right? That's part of why we're having this town hall, is we know that it's complicated. We know, you know, not everybody has been thinking about the harms of surveillance and policing their whole lives. Not that I don't think any of us necessarily have been thinking about it our whole lives, but it takes some time to get there. So one sort of theory of change, if you will, that we use at MJL and the coalition, I think, you know, Stop LAPD Spying and Palestinian Youth Movement and a lot of the folks in the coalition who do grassroots community-based organizing have a similar understanding. So you have 3 levels. You have law enforcement institutions like the Department of Homeland Security and Department of Justice. Then you have all the middlemen. And the middlemen could be teachers, they could be therapists, they could be imams, they could be Muslim political organizations, they could be non-Muslim organizations like Life After Hate that we talked about. There's a broad range of middlemen, and there's a broad range of why they're participating. And then you have the community. And so for all of us who are doing a lot of grassroots organizing, what we found is our strength is in empowering our community first, so that folks can make an informed decision and know who is and isn't participating. And then people can also hold their own leaders accountable. One of the most powerful moments for me was early on, we did a town hall like this, but in real life, when you used to be able to be in a room with 100 people. We did one in Maryland at the Islamic Center of Maryland, and it was about 100 Muslims who came. And many of them didn't know that CVE was happening in Montgomery County, Maryland. And myself and an amazing Somali organizer from Minneapolis spoke about it. And we watched the parents and young people in the room, you know, engage and learn as they went. And by the end of it, they were calling out their imams and their leadership who were in the room for talking to the FBI. And they were able to really, and it was moms, right? It was mostly Muslim women who did this huge push in Montgomery County, Maryland, against CVE, and got the county to even come out against it. So, you know, one of the reasons we're doing this, and we hope that folks might ask us to even host a similar town hall for your masjid or for your local community, and we can tailor it to, like, you know, your local specifics if you want. We think that, you know, when our community knows what's happening, especially young Muslims, Muslim youth, you know, they don't have time for any of this, and they will let you know that they don't want you participating in CVE. So one of the things that you can do after this is actually you can request a workshop from us. And maybe Celine, do you want to share more about the next steps?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks for this, Fatima. So yeah, you can request a workshop or forum for your local org or your mosque by emailing stopcvecoalition@gmail.com. And you can also, if there are any questions that you still have, any unanswered questions, please feel free to email us. And if you're interested in plugging into local organizing, feel free to let us know as well. And also, it would be great if folks could share something they learned on social media and tag hashtag StopCVE. And I just listed a couple of our social media accounts to follow, including Muslim Justice League, Palestinian Youth Movement, Vigilant Love, Believers Bailout, Empower, Stop LAPD Spying, MSA West, and Stop CVE Chicago. So just real quick, if folks can fill out this poll, this evaluation form, and just let us know, just select all that apply to help us figure out our follow-up and upcoming webinars as well. And we'll give a few minutes for this.
And please do share on social media, like things that you learned from this. And also, I guess we can't do like, you know, verbal feedback from you all, but I wanna just say that, yeah, everyone on here tonight, so incredible. I'm so glad that so many folks came out. And I know a lot of people couldn't make it tonight, but it seems like a lot of folks want to have this conversation. So we really hope it was helpful. But you can also share in the chat your gratitude to Yazan and Nabiha and Celine and Nicole and Kifah and Iman and everybody who made this possible if you want. Yeah, keep filling out that poll as you're heading out.
Yes, and we'll definitely be following up with additional resources. Again, if you have more questions, let us know. And we'll be following up about our upcoming webinars where we'll probably delve more deeply into the grants and talk more about alternatives to policing.
We're so glad that you all found it useful.
Thanks so much, y'all, for attending. And we'll follow up soon with further details about upcoming webinars and resources.
Hi.
I don't need to be here for this, right? That feels weird. Or
No, you should. Come join us.